Yo, this is Bench Gamer here. So I've played Genshin Impact patch 3.0 Sumeru for about 15 hours now. I finished both of the acts for the Sumeru Archon quests, and I've done most of the limited time events, with the exception of defeating the Dendro Terrashroom because that's on the western side of the map. I haven't really gone there. I haven't done really anything in the northern side of the map either because the Archon quest didn't take me there. I've done a few runs of the artifact domain just for fun, but I don't really plan on doing more of them because I don't plan on building a Dendro character anytime soon. I have no interest in the current characters. So that's basically where I am in terms of progression, and hopefully this video will just be a short lowdown on my first impressions and experiences. So let's just start with the negatives first. The first big negative, the most obvious one, is that if you were expecting this patch 3.0 to like add more endgame content, to have more hard content, then this patch really doesn't do that. They never really marketed it as something like that. So I don't know why you would think so, but again, just to reiterate, none of the content in Sumeru is any harder than, I would say, that much harder than Inazuma. The mobs are like higher level. I've noticed that there are actually level 91 mobs in Sumeru now, whereas I don't think I've ever noticed that in any other previous region outside of the Spiral Abyss and special events and stuff like that. So we do have beefier enemies, and it seems like the Eremite enemies, the Eremite mobs, which are the equivalent of the Nobushi and Kairagi in Inazuma, they seem to be more aggro in that they run you down. Like they actually have run animations instead of just like wobbling up to you. The Nobushi and the Kairagi also had ways to like get close to you, but they were like special attacks and shit like that. They could either jump at you, uh, they could do like a spinning animation, or they could do a quick draw attack. But that was basically it. The Eremite enemies, the way they run at you is more like the Hilichurls who have that swing torch that is so fucking annoying. But they're like the only they are still to this day like the most difficult mobs in Genshin Impact, even including the Nobushi and Kairagi, because they don't really stagger you as much. So yeah, Eremite mobs a tiny bit harder. They are a bit more aggro. But ultimately, if you can two bang enemies in Inazuma, and if you can finish the Spiral Abyss, then the sumo enemies are going to be three banged at most. So no appreciable difference. Big negative number two. I was hoping that Sumeru would improve the performance of Genshin Impact, the game itself, rather than, go in the opposite direction, which is what seems to have actually happened. So in the past two patches, I've noticed that the stuttering in Genshin Impact has gotten worse. Like, stuttering has always been a problem in Genshin Impact, but over the past two patches, after Chasm got released, it seems like it's just gotten more consistent and more frequent. Not to the point where I can't enjoy the game, but it is there, and Sumeru didn't change that. In fact, it seems to have gone in the opposite direction. Like, I think Sumeru actually takes more resources to run than previous regions. There seems to be more geometry in the environment, and there's like more objects just all around, and even more NPCs in the environment. So, like, for instance, when I was up in the big Sumeru City tree, and if you just pan around your character really fast, you do notice that the FPS drops all the way from the 60s to from a solid 60 to the mid 50s and even low 50s. And these are very, very fast drops and very fast rises. So you're not going to really notice it unless you specifically do that action, which realistically speaking is not going to happen when you're playing the game. It's just something that I've noticed because I have the FPS monitor on. And there was also another instance where, when I was first entering Sumu through the cavern, there was like this one point in the cavern where it would dip consistently to the low 50s and high 40s. And this was the first time this has happened in Genshin Impact for me. It was almost like, what I suspect was happening was that it was trying to load Sumu, but I'm not sure if that is the case either, because I went back inside the cave again and it would drop back into that low FPS. However, once I finished the first Archon quest in Sumu and then went back inside the cavern, it was just normal 60 FPS again. So aside from those two instances and some minor like FPS drops in the environment, because there's just more geometry, and honestly the texture detail also seems a bit better to me. Like, I don't know what it is they did. I think they actually improved the cliffside texture, the stone textures of the cliffs over previous regions. These just seem a bit more detailed to me in general. So that's big negative number two. And the final negative that I've been thinking about is pretty subjective, but Remember how I talked about the Golden Apple Archipelago for this year being a bit more imbalanced in terms of the puzzle content compared to the combat content? Well, that's the same in 3.0 Sumeru, except with the Archon quest and with the dialogue compared to the combat. So, if you're watching this channel, you probably already know that everybody has been complaining that there's just too much unnecessary text, there's too much unnecessary dialogue compared to other types of content in Genshin Impact. People have been complaining about this for years, and that is still the same in Sumeru, and has, in my opinion, even gone worse. Um, when you combine both Archon quests, both acts of the Archon quest together, I can count on one hand the number of combat moments I encountered, and the vast majority of them were in the first act. Once you reach the second act, when you're just confined to Sumeru City, so you're not even doing any exploration, and you can't even do any exploration combat. You're just stuck in the Sumeru City if you want to continue doing the Archon quest. Once you're stuck there, there is only one combat moment, and it's not even like a hype combat moment like the end of Act 2 in Inazuma with the Raiden Shogun. It's more like you're just fighting rando Eremite mobs, and once you defeat them, then that's basically it for Act 2 combat. The rest of the time, you're running from place to place in the Sumeru City, and then you're just skipping through dialogue. If you do skip through the dialogue, I don't. I listened to all of it, and it took me about 2.5 hours to finish Act 2. Act 1 took me a bit longer, but that was mostly because of exploration. So it's almost like Genshin Impact is turning into a visual novel now, and you're just expected to have fun in the open world and do your combat there. But even then, you can't really do that anymore because in Act, there's no incentive to do it if you follow the Archon quest. If you just follow the Archon quest, there's barely anything besides just reading and listening to dialogue. And that did impact my enjoyment of the story. I think the story itself is actually better than the Inazuma story, but the way it's proportioned between dialogue and combat and anything else is just so terrible. It's basically a visual novel at this point, and it feels less like a game every single time. The one hope I do have is that the story has been lengthened to 3.2, and I don't know if they can finish the story in just one more act. So in all likelihood, we are going to get 2 more acts for Sumeru's story. I don't see how they can finish the story anyway else. So there is probably going to be a lot more combat in Act 3 and maybe Act 4. That is my hope at the very least. And there are some rumors that, an enemy will show up in the next, in the next patch or the patch after that. Just some rumors. So that's something to get hyped up about. So those are my big 3 negatives for patch 3.0 Sumeru. So let's just move on to the positive side now. In terms of positives, I already talked about this in my community post, but they did change how special sprints work for certain characters like Ayaka, Sayu, Mona, and even in teleports like Yayamiko and I think also Sarakujo. They no longer get stuck on like ledges as much as they used to. So now when you meet like a small rock, you can just skip over that with your special sprint. I also hope like they would just like introduce a toggle so that we can switch between normal sprint and special sprint, so that they're just as good as other characters, but with the addition of that special sprint. But this is pretty good as well. Very nice change. They also changed how many like loadouts you can have for party compositions. I believe it was 4 before, and now it's 10. I have increased my parties to 5. I haven't really done anything much else with it, but for people who are whales, this is probably a godsend because they can just test out different compositions and test out the meta theory crafting side of things much easier than me, who frankly at this point I don't really even care anymore because this game is just so easy. Yeah, so that's pretty positive. And they also said in the patch notes that they added a sound effect to critical hits. But from what I experienced, the difference between a critical hit versus a normal hit is so small that realistically speaking, while you're playing the game, you will never notice it until you specifically go find it. So it's almost like it doesn't exist. So those are the 3 big changes I noticed in the patch notes. There have also been some changes to how gacha rates work for the standard banner, and not the standard banner, but for artifacts. But I don't really give a shit about that. The game is easy enough that I don't have to care about artifacts anymore. It's just a feel-good feeling when you get a good artifact. That's basically it. So yeah, those are the positive changes I've noticed in the patch notes. Now, the major positive for me for 3.0 Sumeru is just the region itself. The region itself is honestly the most fun I've had exploring a region since I discovered Liyue back in the beginning of the game. Like, when Inazuma released, people were a bit mixed on the design of Inazuma. Some people said it was too purple. Some people said it was too aggressive and too hostile to the player. And some people still thought that Liyue was the best region in terms of design and in terms of just exploration. But my first impression of Sumeru is that it is actually an improved Liyue. Why is that? Well, one of my problems with Inazuma while exploring it was that it felt like the islands were too self-contained. It felt like I had to do one island first and do all of the content in that island before moving on to the next island. And that kind of ruined my immersion of it a bit because it felt like it was gamified. Whereas in Liyue, I could just run from region to region, and there was no like big change between the regions. It was just one contiguous landmass, and it felt like one big region instead of several small regions stringed together, so that it was easier for them to actually just patch in the content. And I don't feel like that in Sumeru. It feels much more like Liyue, and even some of the puzzles and the way the dendro element works makes it feel newer because obviously Inazuma and 2.0 didn't introduce a new element, and some of the puzzles in Sumeru do require dendro now. So it was a lot like when I first discovered Liyue. I had to use my Geo Traveler because some of the puzzles require Geo, and I didn't have a good Geo character. And that's the same with Sumeru and Dendro characters. The problem is that one small downside for me is that I don't really intend on building the Dendro Traveler. I already have a maxed out Electro Traveler, so I just don't want to do it again. I have no interest in Kalei as like a character who is just good. Like I think she is legit just a bad character. So I don't want to build her either, and I do not have the Primo Gems to pull for Tignari. So it does feel a bit cumbersome to have to switch characters all the time and to have basically a dead character, the Dendro character, or on my team when I have to do puzzles. It's a small thing, but it does feel like I'm just kind of wasting my time switching characters all the time. So that's the only downside I can think of in terms of exploration. The environment and the art for Sumeru is just so much better than like what I expected. It's so beautiful, and not just in terms of like the aesthetics. Like there are the actual increases in the kind of I would say like density and geometry and the objects in the world, which is why I think the FPS drops are there, because literally the world is more detailed than previous regions. I think there are more NPCs now in different places. I see more NPCs in Sumeru City. Sumeru City itself is like 2 to 3 times the size of Liyue City, Liyue Harbor, and I would say at least 5 times the size, 4 to 5 times the size of Narukami Island in Inazuma. So it's basically better, bigger than anything else we've ever had in Genshin Impact so far. And not only that, like each region in Sumeru feels like its own city. It feels like each region in Sumeru has its own Liyue Harbor or Narukami Island. There are people all over the place, and it just feels more alive than previous regions. Like I saw a tweet memeing about how the fuck are these actual civilizations when they're literally the size of like a small hamlet or a small village in the real world. Well, Sumeru is the first time I actually felt like it could legitimately be like a living civilization with like actual houses and shit like that. So Sumeru exploration, awesome. I love the puzzles. I think they're not too hard. They're not frustrating in the same way that I found the Golden Apple Archipelago puzzles frustrating. But at the same time, they're not too easy as well. I have to like think about them for a little bit, but then I don't have to think too much about them, and they kind of just get solved, and I can get my Primo Gems in my chest. So the puzzles in Sumeru so far, from what I've experienced, are the perfect balance between rewards and the amount of effort you have to put into them to get those rewards. So everything about Sumeru in terms of exploration, good. And honestly, I think that's it in terms of the positives. The story, again, the balance is off, and no endgame content. We already know about that. Performance hasn't been improved, and yeah, that's basically it in terms of negatives. Positives: the world, the music, the story. outside of like the actual presentation of it, which I guess is like a huge amount of it, but you know what I mean. The story itself is more interesting from like a theoretical perspective than in Inazuma, because I basically knew what was happening in Inazuma. Um, not even considering the leaks. Like I knew what was going to happen in Inazuma without reading the leaks. But in Sumeru, it just feels a bit more original. I just wish there was more combat. Like at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a game. This is supposed to be something that you have to engage in rather than read and listen to all the fucking time. So I hope Genshin Impact and MiHoYo take this advice to heart and improve the game in that direction and improve them for performance and keep up what they're doing with the design of the world and the environment and basically everything else they have done, the music, all amazing. Just please make this game an actual game. Okay, this is Bench Gamer signing out.